5 disturbing true unknown creature stories. What would you do if you came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something not of this world? These are the chilling accounts of people who encountered the unexplainable. Keep watching to find out which one of these stories will haunt you forever. Let's begin. First, Stalker of the Woods. That night still haunts me. Every time I close my eyes, I see those glowing yellow ones staring back. It all started as a peaceful camping trip in the Pacific Northwest, my favorite way to escape the stress of city life. I loved the solitude, the fresh air, and the sense of freedom the forest offered. I had picked a spot far off the beaten trail, surrounded by towering trees and nothing else for miles. The first night was uneventful, almost serene. I fell asleep to the soothing sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. But the second night was different, eerily different. I was sitting by my small fire, reading a book, when I noticed how quiet everything had become. The usual hum of insects and distant hoots of owls were gone. The silence was so unnatural, it made my skin crawl. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the environment. But then I heard it. A scraping sound, faint at first, came from the trees just beyond the firelight. My heart started racing. It wasn't the sound of an animal rustling through leaves. It was deliberate, methodical, like claws dragging across wood. Then, a low growl followed. Gripping my flashlight, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I almost wish I hadn't. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure so tall it towered over the underbrush, at least 7 feet, maybe more. Its body was skeletal, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. The thing's skin was pale, almost glowing under the moonlight, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes, glowed a sickly yellow, locking onto mine as if it could see straight into my soul. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. It just stood there, watching me. Then, without warning, it let out a screech that I can only describe as pure terror. The sound was inhuman, a mix of high-pitched wailing and a deep, guttural roar. I don't know how, but my survival instincts kicked in. I scrambled backward into the tent, fumbling for the zipper as if that thin layer of fabric would protect me. But when I dared to look outside again, the creature was gone. The forest was silent once more, but the oppressive feeling of being watched hadn't left. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, I packed up my camp and left, my eyes constantly darting to the woods around me. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I reported what I'd seen to the park rangers. They didn't believe me. One of them suggested it might have been a bear or maybe a trick of the light. But when they checked the area, they found claw marks, deep, jagged gouges in the trees surrounding my campsite. No known animal could have made those marks. I haven't gone camping since. Whatever I saw that night, it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't my imagination. It was something else, something I pray I never see again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that screech in my dreams. Second, unseen entity. I'll never forget the night we saw it. It started as just another peaceful evening in our quiet suburban neighborhood. My family had lived there for years, and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened, until the night we realized we weren't alone. It started with little things, scratches on the side of the house, odd noises at night, food disappearing from the fridge that no one in the family claimed to have eaten. At first, we thought it was just raccoons, or maybe a prank by some local kids. But then it started to feel intentional. Our dog, Max, was the first to sense it. Late one evening, as we sat in the living room, he started growling low and deep. It was a sound I'd never heard from him before, almost like he was scared, but trying to protect us. His eyes were fixed on the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. I got up to check, flipping on the porch light. The yard was empty, just the usual shadows of the fence and trees swaying in the wind. I chalked it up to Max, overreacting to a stray cat or some movement outside. But the next night, things got worse. This time, Max went into a full frenzy, barking and growling at the same sliding door. My wife, curious, went to calm him down and peeked out the window. What she saw made her gasp and stumble back, her face pale with fear. "What is it?" I asked, rushing over. "Look," she whispered, pointing. I leaned in to see, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the porch light, right at the edge of the yard. It wasn't human. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, almost like sticks, and its skin was pale and shiny, like wet clay. But it was the face, or lack of one, that truly terrified me. Its eyes were solid black, soulless pits, and its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin full of jagged, uneven teeth. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring. I grabbed a flashlight and threw open the door, hoping to scare it off, but by the time I stepped outside, it was gone. I scanned the yard, my hands trembling, but there was nothing, just the eerie quiet of the night. Then I noticed the footprints. They weren't normal footprints. They were long, clawed impressions, almost like a bird's talons, but far too large. They led from the edge of the porch to the fence, and then disappeared. That night, no one slept. Max stayed by the door, growling softly, while the rest of us stayed huddled together in the living room, too afraid to go upstairs. The next few nights were even worse. Scratching sounds at the windows, objects disappearing from inside the house, the constant feeling of being watched. We called the police, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no tracks, no explanation. The final encounter happened a week later. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange tapping sound. It was faint, but deliberate, like someone tapping on glass. Heart pounding, I crept downstairs to investigate. As I turned the corner into the living room, my breath caught in my throat. The creature was back, standing on the other side of the sliding glass door. It was taller this time, its limbs stretched even longer, and it was scratching at the glass with its bony fingers, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. For a moment, it just stared at me, those black eyes drilling into mine. Then it let out a low, guttural growl and vanished, moving so quickly it was almost a blur. The next morning, I told my family we were leaving. We packed up and moved out within a week. To this day, I don't know what we saw, and I don't want to. The new homeowners haven't reported anything strange, but I can't shake the feeling that the creature is still out there, watching, waiting for its next victim. Whatever it wasn't human. 3. The monster of Clearwater. I'll never set foot on Clearwater Lake again. It used to be one of my favorite places, peaceful, scenic, and full of fish. My buddy Jason and I had been going there for years, but that last trip changed everything. It was a cool autumn morning when we loaded our gear into the boat and pushed off from the shore. The water was calm, the sun just rising over the tree line, and the air carried that crisp smell you only get in the fall. It seemed like the perfect day for fishing. For the first few hours, nothing unusual happened. We cast our lines, shared a few laughs, and talked about work and life. But as the day went on, the mood shifted. Jason was the first to notice it. "Hey, do you see that?" he asked, pointing to the water. I followed his gaze and saw ripples moving across the surface. They weren't big, but they were odd, too steady, too deliberate. "Probably a big fish," I said, trying to keep things light. But then the boat rocked. It wasn't much, just a little nudge, but enough to make us both look at each other. "What the hell was that?" Jason muttered, peering over the side. Before I could answer, the water about 20 feet from the boat started to churn. At first, it was just bubbles, then a swirling disturbance that grew larger and larger. We stared, frozen, as something began to rise from the depths. It was massive. The first thing we saw was its body, long, dark and scaly, like the skin of a snake, but covered in sharp, jagged ridges. Then its head emerged, and that's when I realized this wasn't some ordinary animal. The head was elongated, almost like an eel's, but wider and more terrifying. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-like teeth, and it let out a low, guttural groan that vibrated through the air. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard, deep, resonant, and somehow alive. Jason and I both panicked. He grabbed one oar, and I grabbed the other, and we started paddling as fast as we could. The creature didn't dive back down. It moved slowly toward us, its massive form cutting through the water with an eerie grace. "What the hell is that thing?" Jason shouted, his voice trembling. "I don't know!" I yelled back, my hands shaking as I tried to row. Just when it seemed like the creature was about to reach us, it stopped. It hovered in the water, watching us with eyes that were small but piercing. For a moment, time felt frozen, like we were locked in some horrible staring contest with this thing. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it sank back into the depths. We didn't stop paddling until we hit the shore, and even then, we kept looking back, expecting it to rise again. When we reported what we saw to the authorities, they didn't take us seriously. They sent a team of divers out to search the lake, but they didn't find anything. "Probably just a big sturgeon," one of them said dismissively. But we knew better. That thing wasn't a fish. It was something ancient, something that shouldn't exist. Jason and I haven't been back to Clearwater Lake since that day. I've heard rumors from other locals, stories of strange sightings and unexplained disturbances, but none as clear or as terrifying as what we saw. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that low groan, echoing in my mind like a warning. Whatever's in that lake, it's still out there. The Desert Watcher. The desert at night is a strange place. It's so vast, so empty, that it feels like you're the only person alive. For me, a long-haul truck driver, it's just another stretch of highway. Or at least, that's what I used to think, until that night. It was a typical late shift, hauling supplies through the Arizona desert. The road ahead was dark, the only light coming from my headlights cutting through the endless stretch of nothingness. It was around 2 a.m., and I hadn't seen another car in hours. Just me, the hum of the truck, and the faint hiss of tires on asphalt. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved. At first, I thought it was an animal, a coyote maybe, but it was fast, too fast. It darted alongside the truck, staying just outside the beam of my headlights. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I was tired after all. But then it moved closer, and I got my first real look at it. It wasn't an animal. It was wrong. The thing was running on all fours, its limbs impossibly long and thin, its body gaunt and pale, almost glowing under the moonlight. Its head was twisted, almost human but not quite, with elongated features that made my stomach churn. I froze, gripping the wheel tighter as it kept pace with the truck. I pushed the accelerator, hoping to leave it behind, but it didn't even slow down. Instead, it turned its head toward me, and that's when I saw its eyes, black, soulless pits that seemed to drill into my mind. My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. Then it let out a sound I'll never forget, a screech, high-pitched and guttural, like metal scraping against bone. My instincts kicked in, and I floored the accelerator. The truck roared as I pushed it to its limits, the engine straining against the speed. The creature didn't stop. It moved faster, its body jerking and twisting in a way that didn't seem possible. The road blurred as I tore through the night, desperate to get away. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it veered off into the darkness, disappearing into the desert like a ghost. I didn't stop until I reached the next truck stop, my hands shaking as I climbed out of the cab. I checked the truck for damage, half expecting to find claw marks or dents, but there was nothing, not a scratch. I told one of the other drivers about what I'd seen, but he just laughed. "You've been on the road too long, man," he said, slapping my shoulder. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't my imagination. Over the years, I've heard whispers from other truckers, stories about strange figures on desolate highways, things that aren't human. Some scoff, others nod knowingly, but no one seems to have answers. Now, I avoid that stretch of road whenever I can. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, hidden in the vast emptiness of the desert, waiting for the next lonely traveler to cross its path. And I pray I'm never that traveler again. Ainda murder faceless. The Appalachian Mountains have always held an air of mystery. Their dense forests and hidden trails seem to whisper stories of the past, filled with legends and folklore. I never believed those tales until that weekend. My friends and I, Emma, Chris, Laura, and I, had decided to spend a few days camping deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing getaway, but what we found there was anything but. On the second day, while exploring off-trail, we stumbled upon a cave hidden behind a wall of vines. It wasn't on the map, and its dark, yawning mouth seemed almost inviting. Naturally, curiosity got the better of us. The air inside was cold, much cooler than outside, and smelled faintly of decay. Our flashlights illuminated the jagged walls, which were covered in strange carvings, symbols none of us recognized. At the center of the cave was a pile of bones. They were old, bleached white, and scattered haphazardly, some broken and splintered, as though gnawed on. "This is seriously messed up," Emma muttered, her voice echoing in the stillness. "We should go." Chris, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "It's probably just some old hunting spot or something. Don't freak out." Before we could argue, a sound froze us in place. It was soft at first, like shuffling footsteps, but it grew louder, closer. Then it stepped into the beam of our flashlights. The thing was tall, its body unnaturally thin and elongated, with pale, waxy skin that seemed to stretch over its bones. But its face, it didn't have one. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, featureless expanse where a face should have been. None of us moved. None of us could speak. It just stood there, swaying slightly, as though it were watching us, if it could watch at all. Then it took a step forward. "Run!" I yelled, breaking the silence. We bolted for the cave entrance, stumbling over rocks and roots in our panic. Emma reached the clearing first, her breathing ragged as she turned to make sure the rest of us were close. Chris and Laura weren't far behind, but I could hear Ryan's frantic footsteps falter. When I turned back, he was on the ground, scrambling to get up. He screamed, his voice raw and filled with terror. "It's right behind me!" We didn't stop until we reached the campsite. Even then, we didn't feel safe. We packed up as fast as we could and left the mountain, driving in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us. Ryan was the only one who spoke that night. He swore he felt something cold and skeletal brush against his back while he was running. The next day, we returned with local authorities to show them the cave, but when we got there, it was gone. The entrance was completely sealed by rocks and debris, as though it had never existed. There were no carvings, no bones, no sign that we had ever been there. None of us ever went back to the Appalachian Mountains. Emma avoids hiking altogether now, and Chris, the biggest skeptic among us, refuses to talk about what happened. Ryan still wakes up screaming from nightmares of icy fingers and a faceless figure standing over him. What would you do if you encountered something that defied all logic? Would you run? Would you freeze in fear? Or would you never feel safe again? If these 5 disturbing true unknown creature stories left you with chills, don't forget to like and subscribe for more terrifying tales. And if you've had your own encounter with the unexplainable, Share it in the comments below.